Thank you. All right. Welcome new folks to React Denver. It's awesome to see some new faces. We'll get more people online here at 6 o'clock, usually. Housekeeping, this is the trade desk. Our host is also not feeling well, so he's hiding. But if you see Brandon at some point, you can always hide. Bathrooms all the way around the stairs outside. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut. Well, there is a shortcut. You just can't get back in. So front doors. I'm looking for more admins, mods, whatever, organizers, whatever you want to, because I'm by myself tonight, so I have to go man the doors. Anyway, we got Bishop for number 4. I think this is your fourth. Oh yeah, fourth talk. There's Brandon. Thanks. 5 timers club. Doing some state talk today, which I think is always pretty interesting, especially for more junior devs who state gets confusing rather quickly. We have one more meetup for the year next month. I'll be giving a talk about hooks, exactly how they work, and not just useState or useEffect. Like, where do hooks even live, and why rules of hooks and stuff like that. All back to when hooks came out. Ryan Florence was here, gave us a quick talk about hooks, so I thought I'd bring it back up. Good for now. Thank you. Anywho, December or January? December. January, I have a talk, React Native, and then February, I'm already lined for a talk. So I am super happy that I'm getting this far. I was usually flying by the seat of my pants, pulling up a talk the day of. So, all right, hand it over to Bishop. Doug, thanks for joining, and I will stop sharing. Screen share should be enabled for you. Cool. If you could just make sure that, oh, you got to do the door. Yeah, I got to watch the door. I have everything on my phone that I'll watch. All right, want to make sure that people online can hear, but I don't know how to see them. So, can figure that out. Wow. Hello, welcome. Yeah, my name is Bishop Zareh. I'm a senior front-end engineer at a company called Stellar Elements. I work out of the Seattle office, and I am required to say that I do not represent Stellar Elements. I have nothing to do with them other than I work there, but that's the, you know, this talk is just me talking about what I think. Yeah, React, the Big Nerd Ranch guy. So this book, I'm a big guy about books. React Programming, the Big Nerd Ranch, this logo here, this is Big Nerd Ranch. They make a lot of good books. If you want to learn Android or iOS, they make the best books ever. And this is the first React book that they wrote, and it's pretty good. If you don't know React, if you like know Angular or C# or something, and you're trying to get into React, it's a really good introduction. It does a great job of going step by step through each of the things, and constructing them in a way that's works well and you can understand them. So it's a great learning guide for that. I personally don't think it goes far enough. And in particular, scalability is something that I've noticed a big problem with. On my last 3 projects, the whole reason I got the project was because a back-end programmer was like, oh, front end, I know how to do that. And they jump in and they made a total mess of it. And then they call me in to fix it. And a lot of the things that scalability is the thing that if you just took the patterns that are in that React book or the patterns that you learn in a lot of tutorials and just start using those patterns again and again and again and again, eventually you're going to run into scalability problems.
articles. So that's really where I see the big lack, is not so much that the things that are in the book are wrong. They're good, they're just not good enough for big websites like I work on. So the title here, The Missing Manual, that's an old Mac thing. There used to be a thing, Mac, The Missing Manual, and it was basically all the ephemeral stuff about a Macintosh that people didn't know how to use. And that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about here. What are some of those ephemeral things that aren't in the book that we still kind of need? And I think in the book, useState and useContext are well explained. And I think that's true online as well. If you go online, there's lots of tutorials about how to do that stuff. Whereas useReducer and Redux, I think, are not well explained, particularly why are they needed, and how to make them work properly, when to use them and when not to use them. There's a lot of articles out there, but I don't think they do a good job of explaining it. So I wanted to just make a better explanation. So yeah, words. One I didn't write in here, design pattern. I'm going to talk about some design patterns, but you know, there is like the Gang of Five, Gang of Seven, some of this early computer science book that talked about these low-level patterns that every programming language uses, things like inheritance and a singleton. Those are design patterns. Those are not what I'm talking about. When I say design patterns, I'm just talking architecturally. Like, how is it that people make apps? And Flux was the original name of the design pattern that I'm going to focus on. But Redux was the library that became most popular. And in either case, we call the thing that the Flux pattern creates or that Redux creates reducer. And those words, Redux, reducer, they're very steeped in the React ecosystem. And so when other languages, other platforms, things like Vue or Angular went to look at the same technology, they didn't want to call it the same thing, right? So generically, they've called the design pattern unidirectional. I think that's what's in Wikipedia right now. And then just generally data stores is what people just generically refer to this technology. So if you try and search for Vue and Redux, it might be hard to find, but if you search for stores, or Vue unidirectional, you're not going to get much. But this word data stores is what a lot of people use when they write articles about. And other languages do have it too. I put in the intro, I was like, we'll compare it to Angular and Vue, and I was like, this is a React thing. I was going to see how cool we are. We're the React people. We did this whole new. Well, no, they did it too. In Angular, they basically just made a Redux adapter so that you can still use the exact same technology we're talking about here in Angular. And then Vue, they made a different version of Redux called Vuex, so you can do the same thing. So just to start, Create React App. I started doing things well before Create React App came out, so I never really used it much, but it is a really good way to get a website kind of boom, up and running. So then Ottergram, it's like Instagram, but for otters. Yeah, sweet. And then you just run npm start. Let's see if we can do this. Reader. Oh, old state management. All right, here's all these things. Yeah, so let's just go into the introduction, into Ottergram, and npm start. And this is just what Create React App gives us right from the beginning. Zoom window. No, that's not supposed to be it. There it is. And it looks like that. Push this over that other desktop so you can see it all at once. And so it's super simple. They put the logo in here. It says, edit source app. So just look at the code really quick. So when you go in, it's going to give you a public folder. This is where you would put, holy cow. Hold on one second. Okay, we're not going to trust that. So public folder, that's where you put like HTML files or images or things like that. We're not going to mess with that stuff, but it's nice that it's there. And then the source folder, of course, is where everything that we work with is going to be. And, we'll start with just app.js. They do include a lot of stuff for like setting up tests with Jest and running these web vital reports. Apparently they think that's super important. That is not what we're trying to look at. So yeah, you can see it just has a link here to react.org, reactjs.org. And yeah, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Any thoughts, questions about how any of that's working? Just create React app, that's all I did. Like, wow, so impressive. All right, I do want to just show these pictures here a little bit. MVC is a design pattern, an architectural design pattern that almost all software used to be written using this. Still, a lot of software is written using this. And it's a fairly straightforward concept, but we're going to see how the unidirectional or flux design pattern is a little bit different than this. So with MVC, you have your view over here on the right and your model over here on the left. The model is all the data. The view is what gets displayed, and the controller's in the middle, managing between the two. So some of the ideas here is that the view is supposed to be dumb. No business logic goes in the view. No logic over here, and really no logic in the model. The controller is what has all the logic. And the idea is that we have it all in one place, so then it's easier to understand it, reason about it. And if it breaks, we know right where to go to find it. If we had some logic in the view and in the controller, well, then something breaks. We don't know which one is causing the problem. So dumb views, smart controllers, and the model holds all the data. Any thoughts or questions about that so far? Nope. All right, so this is how like WordPress works, right? You've got PHP, you've got some HTML templates, you've got your MySQL database. It all gets mashed together into HTML and JavaScript, gets sent down to the browser. Now that JavaScript may do some things like hover effects or little things, but it does not control anything about the app. Nothing in WordPress, the views never make API calls or anything like that, right? So the views are kept very, very dumb, but really all of this is housed on the server, and it's just the product of this that gets sent back down. But when we wanted to make JavaScript into a powerful language, we wanted to make JavaScript able to utilize all of the things that it can do, people have started to scratch their head and say, how do we do this MVC design pattern with part of it being on the client and other parts of it being on the server? And so initially the idea was, well, let's just take the view and send that down to the client. But then the JavaScript, as it gets more complex, starts to run amok. It starts to be logic that's inside the view and not inside the controller. So this kind of broke down our notion of how MVC was supposed to work. So then single page apps started to try and do this. Okay, well, there would be a front end controller. That would be like a router, right? We're going to have a router and that will control which view gets displayed. And then if we need data, we'll make an API call out to some data service. And eventually we discovered that lots of times we actually need that data on the front end. We can, maybe we can just make an API call every time we need data, but if we need the same piece of data twice, it's better for us to store it on the front end. And so then a lot of JavaScript frameworks that were based on jQuery work just like this. They were still model view controller, but they were all on the front end. And then they communicated through an API to some backend service that could work any way it wanted. The first, as far as I know, the first major change to that architecture was Flux. You have your views, still fairly dumbish. This is one aspect that I really try to push. The view components, even when we're using this design architecture, still we try to keep all the logic outside of them. We put all of the logic into the actions or into the reducer. And the idea is that any external communication is happening by the actions, and then the reducer does any data or business related logic. And by separating the concerns of the original controller, it's a lot easier to reason about where problems might happen. If it's a display problem, maybe it's in the view, but if it's a logic problem, is it because of the APIs or is it because of the logic surrounding the data? And we have these selectors that just go back. So the frailty of MVC is these bidirectional arrows. The example that I use frequently is optimistic updates. Someone's going to click save. Well, you have to go to the database, you have to do a save, you have to get the confirmation of that, and then display to the user that it worked. But a lot of times users want that input back immediately. And as designers, we want to give it to them, right? We want to give them that experience. Like, yeah, it worked, because it's going to work 99 out of 100 times. So optimistically, the controller would update the view and say, yeah, the save worked. And then behind the scenes, it would go and actually do the save. But then the controller is in this difficult situation where if the save doesn't work, this is the 1 out of 100 times where it doesn't work, the controller has to then go and take away parts of the view that it put there and then add in more parts of the view. And the logic to take things away and add more things and handle every error state ended up being a lot of code inside of the controller, because the controller is trying to sit in the middle and do everything. Whereas when we have a one-directional design pattern, you know, when an API is going to make a save, it can put in an optimistic and the view will display it. Then when the negative state comes back, that will go to the reducer and be reflected in the data, and the view will represent that data as well. We don't need this kind of controller in the middle telling the views all what to do. The views simply display the data. Whatever the data says, that's what it is. So that's the kind of advancement that we're trying to get to talk about this new design pattern. Any thoughts, questions? Comments? Oh. Okay, let's jump in. All right, so basics here. Each of these are just going to be further iterations on our autogram. App.js. So one of the cool things about Create React App, you can import images directly into it. So you just import that as Berry, and we can see our app turns a header, an H1, and then it's got a list. Each list item has a button and inside the image, and we just pass that right here to Berry. Cool, let's see what that looks like. /2- headers npm start. Go. Then this should start up here in a second. There it is. Otters. We have otters. These are all like not professional photos. These are like scientists taking photos. They're all like in the National Archives or whatever. Yeah, there's Barry, Robin, Maurice, Leslie, Barbara. Cool. So we already got 5 otters signed up to our website. We're super excited about it. We're going to hit 100 million otters by the end of the year. Yeah. So what's some problems? What's some problems here? Like, to me, when I look at this code, if somebody turned this in a code review, I would immediately bounce it back and I would make one comment. And there's maybe some other things. I'll show you a little thing. Maybe this. Like the alt tag is Barry for the otter named Barry. And yet right next to it is a paragraph that says the exact same thing. So a sighted user is going to see a picture and the word Barry, and a screen reader is going to read Barry. Barry. Why would we want him to read it twice? That makes no sense, right? So this should pretty clearly be just quote, quote. Okay. What's another problem? Why would this get bounced out of code review?
Repetitive.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Look at all these. Yeah. I mean, anytime that you see a repeated pattern, right, that's something that should be factored out. It's the kind of half the point of what we're doing. All right, so let's look at a version where that's factored out. This is just basically me going through and componentizing it. So now we import all of our JPEGs, and then we create this data object, otters array. Put all our otters in there. And then the app gets a lot smaller. Ottersarray.map. We get a post. I don't know why it's called a post, but then we feed it into this custom component called post. What does that look like? We go to our post. It's pretty straightforward. It's that repeated pattern we had: LIs, buttons, images, paragraph. Now we don't have to repeat that, so it's much drier. We also pulled the header out. The header's only used one time, but still, it's nicer to have a smaller set of things to deal with. And so, sorry, close. Where'd it go? header, it's nicer to have a smaller set. This is really how components should look, is that they should be using subcomponents and just describing the kind of structure that goes around them. It's pretty straightforward, but I would let this get through code review. There's a couple of things I don't like about it. One thing is that I just don't like this. I understand what's going on, right? That's the list of all the otters. So if I want to change the list of all the otters, then I could add or remove from this list. But it's a random piece of data. It's just some data that's just hanging out here for no reason. So like in terms of our design pattern, data goes in the model. I don't know, this just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's just right here in the, and if more than one thing needs to use this otter array, oh, what, then somebody's gonna eventually go over here and export it, right? Oh, now we don't even know where the thing is used. It could be used everywhere and anywhere. And if we make a change, we have no idea what that change is gonna result in. So I'm not in love with that. Okay. But let's see what happens when we actually start trying to make some things work here. So what we want to do is we want our autogram so that you can click on it. Let's try that. CD. Otters. Okay, that'll come up in a minute. We want them so they can click on them. So we updated the styling here a little bit, but the idea is if we click on Robin, then that otter gets featured. You can go through and click on each of them. Yay! So didn't have to add too much code in order to make that happen. Otter 3, source, app.js. You can see we still have all our JPEGs coming in. We still have our data object. We've added 2 new things here at the top of the app. Then we've got our header, our post list, and we added this new item here, selected item at the bottom. And it just passes these images in. That a little bit smaller so you can see a little easier. All right, let's just, I guess, discuss a little bit what these are. So these first 2 lines, all we've done is a useState here. So useState gives us the current state and then a way to change the current state. And the thing on the right here, this is the default value. And we have made that otter array 0.name, so that's going to be Barry. So we're starting with Barry as our default value. We then use whatever the selected post name is, and we go through and look for an otter with the same name. So that's going to be then this entire otter object, which includes in selected post. And we then pass selected post into our selected item. Now, why did I put a question mark on that?
If it's empty.
Well, how could it be empty? I mean, we put Barry in there, right? Barry is the name of an otter. So how could selected post be anything other than just that first item?
It's updated to something.
It could be changed. Yeah, look at this. Post, we pass in set selected post name. We pass that in to our post. So if we go and take a look at that component, now it gets its selected post name. And when you click on the button, it sets its selected post name to the name. And we know that name is what it's triggered on here, right? The name, yeah, let's see, yeah, otter.name, that's how it finds. And we pass the name in right here, and set selected is going to use whatever we passed in here. So those should always be names. So there should always be, you know, when we hover over that selected post, TypeScript is like, hey, it can be undefined. For all the reasons you're just saying, right? It could change. And yeah, we know, we have confidence. We know the first one's Barry, and we pass the name in, and that thing only uses the name, so they're going to be names, so that's always going to work. But we don't write code for ourselves. We write code for other people. We write code for the developers that come to our project after us. We write code to try and make it easily maintainable. And while we know that this works, someone else could go edit post, not understand the exact same coordination that we did, and thus selected post may become undefined. So I just put a question mark there. Without that question mark, it would bomb the app. With the question mark, it would just simply result in undefined and we get a broken image. So it's a little less harmful. But this is a big part of what we're talking about, is how do we keep these things in coordination with each other? I can do it as a programmer, but once you get lots of people working on lots of different things, it could easily become a crapshoot. Okay. So that was state. Let's look at, so then we got a second feature request here that we wanted to use context for because it's like a site-wide thing. Create context. Let's take a look at the app. Others. Pretty much the same thing, but we have a new requirement. We have to handle light mode, dark mode. Yep, because it's, you know, better for the environment and better for people's eyes and all these things. So we didn't have to build it all in. We don't have the designs ready yet, but we wanted to make a proof of concept. So we built in this toggle brightness button, and all it does is, wait, yeah, it switches it from light to dark mode sometimes. Okay. So how is that done? You notice here, we're back at the app level. But all the stuff that was part of the app is now gone. It's been bundled down into Otter Page. And if we look at Otter Page, it has all the same stuff that it had before. But now it's one layer deeper. And we did that so that we could encase it in this provider. Usually the top level application, that's where you encase it in the router and the providers and all of the stuff that you use to set up the app. And this provider, so just comes from theme context. Theme context here comes from create context, which we can see as part of React. So we've created a set of constants for what are the different values of brightness. And then we create useState and give it a brightness dark as its default. And that gives us brightness and set brightness. And then we use those two values and construct them into a theme and provide that to the value of this provider tag. And that makes that theme value available then to every component in the application. Yay. No, don't say. It changes. All right, so let's, Otter Page. Oh yeah, the header. So the header here is where we make use of that set brightness. We do a use context and pass in the theme context that we created at the app in the application. You can see theme context coming right in from app, brightness coming in from app. We then gives us brightness and set brightness, same as useState would do. We then put the brightness just in the class name. And then we have this little gem. Oh, wait a minute. That's not what that's supposed to be. And I put that in there just because, you know, people make mistakes. We can't always rely on everybody's code to be perfect. This is supposed to be, what, if brightness equals brightness dot dark. Then it will switch to light, otherwise switch it to dark. So that code actually works, but this is logic. And this is exactly the kind of logic that when we want to make our views dumb, this is exactly the kind of logic that can go wrong. I just made it go wrong. Also, you know, we imported these constants, great, and we made it work. We made everything fit together. But again, if somebody doesn't understand the rules and they go and start updating things and adding features, they could very easily not realize that they're supposed to be following these constants. Or not realize, and what's going to happen here? If we use set brightness and we set it to something called like garbage, we just set it to garbage, well, then that set brightness is going to change the value of brightness that's provided through the provider. And then every other feature that tried to make use of that value is suddenly going to break. Not because they did it wrong, but because we did it wrong and we're affecting their code. So this is the major problem with context. It solved a big problem for us, but it created a new problem. The big problem it solved is that now we can get data anywhere. We can get it to any of the apps. We don't have to do prop drilling. Right? If we go back and look at Otter Page, right? This is kind of Sketchtown to me. I mean, I understand why image and name are put in here, but passing in a set state into a child. Yikes. Or this derived value, passing it into selected item. Wouldn't it be nice if selected item just knew what item was selected and then it could just display that one? It doesn't need to, we don't need to pass it in. And when you get bigger and bigger component structures, passing it from parent to a child, to a child, to a child, to a child is called prop drilling. And this is an anti-pattern. This is something we don't want. If you're passing it in one layer down, that's okay. If you're making a common component that we want to be reused many times, okay, then we're going to pass some stuff into it. But in general, if you can avoid passing in props, we should. And context allows us to avoid passing in props. But the same problem that we noted earlier, where we have to create the data and it has to be in coordination with everything. Well, at least all the stuff is right here. I've got my useState right here. The data is right there. This is my child component, or I guess this one is. So I've got it all right in one place. When we go to useContext, we are now providing that to the entire application. So we're exacerbating this problem of if someone makes a mistake, it's going to break it for everybody. Exacerbating. So that's fine. That's useContext. They still can be valuable. It's generally for just these site-wide type values. Okay. So at this point, the autogram doesn't change. I could show you each version just to show that they're working. I think toggle brightness should work more predictably. Now, I guess maybe I didn't save that. Yeah, I didn't save that change. All right. But yeah, so let's look at the same thing, but with a reducer. So here the code starts to change. The visuals don't change at all. All we're doing is talking about looking at a different way of doing the same thing. Now, notice we're still doing create context. We are storing the reducer in a context. So context is what allows it to be accessed from everywhere. But rather than just making it raw values that have no protection, we put it into this thing that we created called a reducer. And we call useReducer on that. And we get two things back from that. We get the data that's in the reducer and a dispatch function that we can use to signal an action, to trigger an action. But same thing as before, we put those into our theme and use the provider to provide them everywhere. So before we get to the reducer, let's look at the changes that created in our components. So here before, we were using useContext and getting the brightness directly. Now we get this data object and we're able to pull brightness out of it and use it all the same way. And slightly different here on the onClick, now we use dispatch and we give it a type. And we're pulling from this actions constant that we can see is defined up in our reducer. So every dispatch will just simply have a type. And if we need to, we can add data onto that type. So for instance, when we have a post, when someone clicks on the select button, we're going to dispatch actions.select and include the name of the thing that they clicked on. So that, that can be stored in the reducer. Notice here that we don't get data because we don't need data. So this kind of helps. Now, if you only need data, you can get it. If what you need is to trigger an action, you can get just dispatch, and kind of differentiates those two. Selected item, we only need the data. We don't need to use dispatch. We can see this makes it a lot simpler. Still otters.find. So check that out. Now we're doing otters.find. Otters is also stored in the data. It's kind of nice. So let's look at that reducer. So notice all of our JPEGs came up in here now. And our brightness constants. And we'll see down here, here's all of our otter data objects. So one nice thing about using a reducer is that it centralizes all of these constants that are how you would put this data together. We did add this new actions constant that has our actions on there. We added some nice name spacing so that actions don't collide with each other. And then our reducer is pretty straightforward. And again, just about the missing manual. I mean, the parts, not only is this reducer not covered in the book, But usually when you look at any example or tutorial on this online, instead of returning another function, they write the return value right inside of this huge switch statement. And since they only did like 3 switches, it looks fine. But as soon as you've got like 20 switch cases, 20 different cases in the switch statement, you can't have the logic in there as well. So this is a really nice pattern to just separate the logic from the case statement. And then we go and just write some basic stuff. We take the old state, and then on top of it, we add that one little bit of logic that was out in that view. Now it's centralized into a central place, into our reducer. So if there's any problem with how the state changes over time, we can address that right here in one place. And we can add in other stuff. We can add in more safety. Like if the ordered name doesn't exist, then don't change its value. Only if it exists should you actually update the selected item. So now we've got a lot more safety. If someone calls a dispatch and they call it with the wrong action, it's just going to do nothing. If they call it with the wrong data, we have a way of creating safety around the data that we have. Now, maybe we could have done that in our previous applications, but it would have been adding more and more and more logic into a view, which probably shouldn't have it. Is that kind of vibing on that? Okay. So yeah, that's the basics of a reducer. The main reason that you need to use a reducer over state is if your state is used in multiple places. I did not factor out everything out of the otter page here, but selected item, for instance, now it doesn't need to get. Oh, did I? Yeah, I still made that passed in. But sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one here now. Yeah, selected item no longer needs its values passed in. So this is a case where more than one thing needs to know what the selected item is. The post needs to be able to set the selected item, and yet selected item here needs to know which one is selected. And in the past, when we were doing that with state, we had to have all 3 of these components all in careful coordination with each other. Now we don't. Anything can access what's in the reducer. Selected item is autonomous. And so that makes just our application structure a lot simpler. I think that was about all on that. Yeah, didn't have dispatch. Now, I do want to point out one thing here, another missing manual thing. When you write these functions, like toggle brightness, every example I can find online uses destructuring. This is destructuring the old state. The reason you want to destructure the old state is that we want this function to return a pure object. And a pure object is not one that existed before, it's a new one, it's a brand new object. And that's a weird concept in JavaScript. I don't know of anything else that works off of pure objects. Only reducers, only in Redux do you need this, do you have this requirement. And destructuring only destructures one layer. So actually there would be a bug in here if anyone ever tried to go and use the dispatch to update one of these otters. Because if you look at a destructure, it's going to destructure state. That's the whole state object, which is going to destructure this property, which is an array. So it's going to destructure the array. It's just going to not destructure all the objects that are in the array. Destructure doesn't go multiple layers deep. And so you have to have a more complicated solution in order to do this stuff right. And so this is a huge part of the confusion that developers have when they first start using Redux, and it leads them towards this thing where they're like, I'll just put it all in state, or I'll just make sure that things are coordinated. Because when they first try and use a reducer, they don't return a pure object, and then the reducer doesn't update itself, and it's confusing and difficult to troubleshoot and figure out why. And lots of times it's just that these destructures don't go multiple layers deep. So we need a more complicated solution for that. I would show you what the more complicated solution is, but this whole problem has been solved with the invention of, oh, I'm sorry, this is still just a reducer. Let me show you Redux. It's the same thing.
No, I was going to ask, what would that more complicated solution look like? And but it sounds like he's getting to that.
Okay, so sorry, before we get to Redux Toolkit, which is the better solution, Redux, you can see it looks almost exactly the same. Actions, initial state is the same. The reducer's the same. Our toggle brightness and toggle select order are the same. The only difference is how they're set up in a slightly different way. No longer do we need to use context. We create this one file. Oh, sorry, here it is, Redux. Yeah, toggle brightness. And then, yeah, we just create a little bit extra boilerplate. And this allows us to have multiple reducers that all return to the same root reducer so that anybody can get any data. You'll notice that this is crossed out. And it says, yeah, create store is deprecated. This is the old way of doing it. But yeah, you add the root reducer. You can add in middleware called thunk. I can show you right here what a thunk is. You can have a toggle action that receives dispatch and then sends its dispatch. This is a thunk where you pass the name into select action and then it dispatches that name. So let's just see how that's used really quick. Components, post, select action. It's a function that we pass the name into, and then it returns a function that receives dispatch. Whereas if we don't need to pass information in, like with toggle, we can simply say dispatch toggle action. So the difference of thunk is just whether you're passing a value in or not. It's just weird language, and it makes it harder to understand everything. Okay, so sorry, make sure let me close everything here. Close all. Reducer, not reducer, Redux. Redux. Okay, so just a little bit extra boilerplate, giving us the ability to kind of provide a wrapper around the actual dispatches here, that this dispatch here is going to send it to the reducer, but this allows us to make an API call and wait, do an async and wait until it comes back and then dispatch things. Or if we're trying to do that optimistic thing I was talking about earlier, we would dispatch one action out that says it worked. Then we would do our API call, and when it comes back, we would update based on whatever the API said. So a little bit extra capability there for just a slightly bigger application. Now I can put in here, I can show you what the right way to do this is. If you do have to go back and use old Redux, is that you create a new state and you equal this, and you're gonna, if I just set it equal to state, that's not gonna do the trick because it's gonna copy that object by reference, right? So it's not a new object. So you're gonna hate me. You're gonna so hate me. And I've done a ton of research. This is actually the best way to do that. There's a whole bunch of people, you look at that and people are like, no, that can't be efficient. And then you actually compare it to other solutions. You're like, damn, this is actually really fast. So this is actually, and then you can do whatever you want to new state dot selected. Selected item. Return new state. And I don't know, sometimes people don't like this because they're like, it's too simple. I want to use the fancy destructuring because that's part of ES9 or whatever. I'm like, okay, fine. If you want to use the fancy way, you've just got to learn how to do it at each layer down. Whereas if you use this way, you always know that new state is a fresh copy. But as I said before, we don't even need to do this anymore because of Redux Toolkit. So let's take a quick look at Redux Toolkit. And yeah, store from our toolkit file, our data file that we created. So sorry, that's Redux Toolkit. I named the file that. That's not actually from. But differently here now, the provider is still coming from React Redux instead of from create context. And it's the word store instead of value, I think is what it was on the other one. But basically the same thing. Now, on 2 projects ago, we had a big working in production app, And a lot of it was built using Redux. And we got a new developer in and was like, I like Redux Toolkit. Can we use it? And that conversation came up time and time again. We had that same conversation like 10 times. And every time I would be like, well, can we mix the two? Do we have to convert everything over to Toolkit? Or can we just start with one new Toolkit reducer and leave all the old ones the same? And they were like, I don't know. Nobody knew. None of us knew. Well, the fact is, yes, you can do that. Once you flip over your store to using Redux Toolkit, it can also use any of the old reducers. So here is Configure Store, which is the new version of Create Store for Toolkit. And you feed in the reducers. You can see here that this one is the previous reducer that I built for Redux. That one works just fine. And we can have a new one here that is Redux Toolkit. All we do is we pass the reducer property instead of passing the actual reducer. No difference. So you can mix and match. So I would recommend if you're ever going to do any go to create a reducer, Toolkit is better. Now, the argument that we talked about earlier is the original native implementation of useReducer and useContext. Maybe is that better than Toolkit because it's less code? And I would say yes, but this problem of pure state is really hard for beginning developers to understand. It's a huge source of problem. Even I spent hours troubleshooting some stupid pure object problem. And Redux Toolkit gets rid of the need for all of that. So I would recommend Toolkit over top purely for maintainability. And maintainability, I think, becomes scalability. But yeah, let's look at the whole thing. Okay, so back up to the top, still importing our JPEGs, still have all of our constants. Initial state looks exactly the same. Now, these are the two functions that we had below the reducer before. These are the ones that actually do the state changes. I call them transformers. They transform state. And you can see it's our little bit of logic here and our little bit of safety that we wanted to add here. But we're not creating a new object. That's the huge thing that Redux Toolkit does, is now you can modify state directly, and behind the scenes, it makes it into a new object for you. Yay! Thank you. That's super helpful. Slightly different way to create the reducer. Now, instead of naming each of our actions individually, we give it simply the namespace, and it will then automatically create all the action names for us. So less boilerplate. We pass in the initial state, and then our two reducer functions, which were toggle and select. And notice these names that we gave them here, toggle brightness and select item. So after we configure that into a store, rather than creating all of the actions, sorry, let me get rid of these files, see the full line, we can simply get them from our reducer.actions. And it creates toggle brightness and select item as functions that then make that state change that we saw up above. So those automatically get exported because we gave them these names here. So select item will simply call this select, but this is the part that does the transformation. The select item that we get out here, this is the thing that we pass into the view to allow the view to change which item is selected or change the brightness. And then with Redux, you get one final added notion of a selector, so that while it is a global state, all of the reducers are stored in one root reducer. You can control which access levels people get based on which function that they call. All of these selectors receive the root state and then just single it down to either one value or one set of values. And so these are simple functions, but of course, if there was like some modification that you wanted to do to the data for the view. So a good example of that is if you have a form, you're going to have all the form data in a reducer. Whether that form data is valid or not, you don't need to store all that in the reducer. That's something that a selector can derive from the state. So selectors sometimes will derive, are these values valid or not, and include that along with the values for the view. But that doesn't need to be stored separately in the reducer. It can be a derived, it can be a derivative. So yeah, selectors give us a lot of capabilities.
Are selectors memoized?
By default, I don't know. That's a good question. I can look it up. So that's, I mean, that's the end of the code that I had, and I didn't really have much of a conclusion. But I do want to, I guess, just talk a little bit about, why. So the main difference here, when we went with useState, yeah, my conclusion folder is empty. Oh, sorry. Yeah, let's go back and look at architecturally here. Wait. So when we first started, we had parent and child components, and then we had this otters array, which was our data object. That's where all our data came from. And so if we were to draw that out, these are pretty dumb, and all the data is in one place, so it looks great. And trouble comes into paradise when we start adding more functionality. So when we created a useState, well, now useState is going into app, but then coming back from post. This is not looking like any of the architectural patterns that we looked at, right? This is an MVC, it's not one directional. What is it? It's spaghetti. It's spaghetti code. And if you just follow the patterns that are in the book or in the tutorials, this is the structure that it will have you build, because they don't get far enough to take this top-down level view, 10,000-foot view of how is the architecture, how is the application working? How are the pieces connecting to each other? And so then, now we've got 3 data sources, a useContext, useState, and an array. This one goes in here and then pops out there. This one now these all actually go into Otter page. So when we were looking at it before, we could sort of kind of pretend that app.js was our controller. When we were even back to this one, this kind of looks like a controller. And, in terms of keeping everything in coordination with itself, with each other, that's kind of what app.js was doing. It was starting to act as a controller, as the bridge between the data and the views. And then you get to here, and now app.js isn't doing that. Otter's doing it for 2 things, but app is doing it for 1 thing. And as this structure grows and grows and grows, you get all these circles that are all just coming from everywhere and going everywhere. You can't tell who communicates with what. And that's Redux. That's Redux Toolkit. With Redux, we didn't do anything with the actions. This is useReducer. So this is the native implementation in React. And it's basically the one directional. The actions are really not a thing. People kind of are directly operating on the reducer. And Redux gives you just a little bit of safety there by just making the actions more of a gatekeeper, so that API calls can go out and come back in before the things get sent to the reducer. And we've got our selectors down here to kind of modify the data on the way back to the view. Should be. That feels well architected. And we don't have to have a bunch of circles and a bunch of squares and all that stuff, because everything in the application is working in this exact same way. Now, yeah. Am I saying you should always use a reducer? No. So let me talk about what each of these things are good for. So useState is good if there's only one thing that needs this information. Okay, that's rule number 1. If 2 things need the information, it goes in the reducer. It could go in context. Context is another broad level thing. But with useContext, it's really for things that are meant to be site-wide and never change. The reducer is what controls the life cycle of change. And so useContext doesn't have any kind of life cycle. So it's not good for data that changes frequently. It's really good for site settings or session storage, something like that. You would put that into useContext. useState is great if it's only needed in one place. And there's a second rule that I would give you for useState. And that is, does anyone care? Does anybody care? Does anybody care about that piece of information? So for our autogram, You know, we may build this and think, oh, well, which otter is selected? That's nobody cares about that. Like we show it to the user and that's it. And if all of this were one component, then useState would be a great way to handle this. But what happens when the business people come and they're like, wait, which otter is selected? We need analytics on that stuff. We need to make business reports with graphs and like lots of charts and stuff. And as soon as somebody cares about it, you need to move it into the reducer, because what's going to happen is that there's going to be analytics work that's added on top of that, right? We go back to one of our early examples with state, with useState here. So here we have this post and it's receiving all of its information. So that's what you would call controlled. It doesn't really know what it's doing. All of its functionality, all of the display properties are all being passed into it. All it knows is its structure. To do. Let the analytics people know. Right, so now I'm going to make an API call right in the middle of this view. There is no place for this. It doesn't feel like it goes in post. But if I look at app, like app just calls post and tells it what to do. Like where would we send an API call to the analytics engine? I don't know. We could maybe make like a use effect here. So we could do a use effect here and make an API call with that. But this also feels very inappropriate. It's like there's this new requirement that has nothing to do with our old requirement, but we need to find a place to put it. And none of the views seem appropriate. And then when you go to a reducer, you're like, oh, well, there's a really great place where you can make, and some of the applications I've worked on, one single action can trigger off 10 different API calls. And some of them are dependent. If this call comes back, then you need to make these other 3 calls. And so all of that logic has a place to live. And for me, that's what makes working in React a pleasure, is because with Redux, there is a place for everything. And I guess what I've been asking you to do as we've gone through these is to not like just evaluate code as in like, oh, well, this is what I type in to make it work, but start to evaluate it based on the role that it plays. Is it logic? Yeah, oh, I guess I don't have any logic in there. Is it logic or is it data or what is it? What role does it play, right? And that's why I initially was concerned with this. Its role is data. So having it here in a view doesn't feel very appropriate. Is it wrong? No, it's not wrong. It's just, it will have problems as we try and scale the app. The bigger the app gets, the more of those cross-connection problems that we're going to have with it. So that's what, again, makes it an absolute pleasure to work with React. And the thing that I love is that when you go to build a new feature, you start in a view and you build up and tell it to send an action, then you build the action, then you send that to the reducer, and you build the part of the reducer, and then you build the selector, and the view gets the selector, and you built a new feature. You're done. It's like a lap. It's just like a round trip. You just run around the app. Just keep going. And the faster that you can crank it, the faster you can churn out features. And there is never a point where I'm confused about where I'm going next. If I'm in the view, the next place I'm going is actions. And then I'm going to the reducer, and then I'm going right back to the view. It's just a round trip. So there's none of that confusing part with controllers where it's like, well, now I need to go over here and talk to them, and now I need to go to this or to the other side and talk to them. None of that. It's very simple. So I like that, having a place to put everything. I know where it's going to go, and by isolating the concerns of each thing, we also know how to fix them. We know where to go looking when things go wrong. So yeah, did I do it? Did I convince everybody? You're like, yes, toolkit, we're gonna use that on everything now. Yeah, not everything. Again, state is great. If it stays in one place and nobody cares, use state. If everybody needs it, but it never changes, use context. Everything else, use Redux Toolkit. My opinion, but it's well seasoned after hundreds and hundreds of these projects. No questions. I think, oh, there was 1 or 2. Yeah, what's up?
What does Redux Toolkit have for async actions? async actions like promises or
Huh?
requests?
It works the same as Redux would normally.
My experience with Redux was like you needed a separate package for that, like Redux promise or Redux thunk.
Thunk.
Is it built in now? Or?
I believe Thunk is built in, yes. Yeah, it's these actions. So toggle brightness here is the automatically created action. So all you would do is like export like toggle safe or something that, you know, is also a function and is going to call toggle brightness. But now we can go in here and yeah, this is fine for async or for await. API call. Whereas before, yeah, we needed that thunk middleware that was in the Redux example.
It still uses the thunk middleware, it's just batteries included.
Probably. Where'd it go? Oh, it's in the store.
Because it's the older Redux saga.
And there have been a million ways of doing this. Yeah, here it is included in the middleware in Redux. And then I think it's automatic, yeah, in Toolkit. This has been a long path. And I think part of the being good at being a programmer is being good at like picking out technologies. And I think over time you see what things succeed and what things fail. And it becomes a lot easier to have that foresight of knowing whether it's going to succeed or fail before you choose it. And with Redux is here to stay, obviously. So is React. And I don't know, years ago, a student was like, I taught them React, and then they were like, well, why do you teach us Angular? Can't teach everything. And at the time, I was like, I know that React is going to win out over Angular. I just know that. And it wasn't at the time, they were 50-50. And now you read the latest numbers. Angular's going right downhill. Vue, I think, is kind of maintaining, hanging on. But
I feel like Vue is like Ember. Just like has that dogmatic group that's not going to move.
Yeah, and sometimes you get that. You get a small group, but they're persistent. They love it. It's good too. And some technologies are meant to solve lots of problems. Others are meant to solve just one problem. So there's that too. Yeah, any other thoughts, questions, comments? We got a little more time. Yeah.
Have you looked into or do you have any thoughts on like the alternative state management solutions like Jotai or Zustand? There's a couple of them that they're very like hooks based and they kind of remove a lot of the boilerplate of Redux. Do you have any experience with those or compared them?
I don't. Yeah, I have seen people use hooks to more effect than I do to get around some of the problems that reducers solve. So they have the problem, the reducer would solve it, they didn't want to use the reducer. So they used use effect with complicated stuff. So I know some of that is possible. I think it's interesting, I haven't looked at it yet.
Redux Toolkit is one of its main purposes is to reduce that boilerplate though.
Yeah. Yeah, that's expressly why they made it.
I did a demo of Zustand a couple months ago. I actually liked it a lot. It gives you, it's context bound, even like Redux Toolkit. They use the same external store. Curious, but the export is the hook, and it's just an object. You export an object, and it's just you have your properties methods on the object, and that's it. I actually liked it a lot. I did not dig deep into its performance characteristics, but it was far less boilerplate than even RTK. Cool.
Yeah, and people are trying it all kinds of different ways.
And Jotai is pretty much a stand-in replacement of Recoil. Recoil was a Facebook project, experimental state management, and it never got a lot of traction from within Facebook, and it just did a lot of layoffs. So Recoil is basically shelved, and Jotai actually follows a lot of the same principles. So why create two things when
How does like RTK query play into this? Like, where would you use that versus say using the full like RTK, the Flux?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll create place.
The reason I ask is we built our last app with RTK query.
Okay.
We keep our state, basically our state is saved into a database and then we just pull it out.
Yeah.
Then we use the useContext to handle like the 8 pieces of like data that we needed that didn't need to be in there. And so I was wondering if like maybe a more architecturally appropriate like approach would have been to just put that useContext into, because it is changing data. It's just not stored data.
Mm,
If we should have used it through the like regular RTK.
probably you should have. And not that, again, not that it's the worst thing ever. It's in context instead of this other place, whatever. So RTK query is just another feature of React Toolkit. It's one that I haven't used a whole lot, but it does, yeah, it manages more of that connection with the database and the API so that you can do caching and slicing and things like that. So a lot of the same
Optimistic loading, things like that.
yeah, a lot of the same advantages that a selector gives you on the front end, but that it gives you those advantages for the back end, where you can provide data safety, you can make derivatives, you can slices, yeah. Fetch on remount, whatever. So yeah, I'll look up, we should make another one. This presentation came from questions that people asked, so like now, hey, RTK query, that's our next presentation. Recording. Oh yeah. All right.
All right. We're gonna zoom some. All right. Well, that's it for tonight. We have about a half an hour, 20 minutes to hang out and chat and create some friends before they give us the boot. Otherwise, next month is also a week of a holiday. So, but December won the poll. I gave a poll saying, "Do you want to have one?" And it was 7-2. So it wasn't a landslide, but it was a fairly good margin. So, anywho, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording and let's hang out.